Okay, hello, welcome everyone to Scientia Science Writing Internship webinar. This is the last webinar of our series, but it is one of the very important speakers, and it would be a unique experience as always. This is a recurring webinar. We usually covered a lot of social media and online science communication stuff. So today's title would be Navigating Social Media Communication in 2026 by Dr. Alex Dainis. And Dr. Alex Dainis is one of Scientia's advisory board members. She is a prolific speaker and, more importantly, an amazing one of the internationally acclaimed science communicator within the realm of genetics. And she has been all over LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok, if you can look up. And within the SciComm world related to chemistry, genetics, and biology, she is reshaping the narrative for body and audiences, reaching. And her previous background includes working for American Chemical Society, PBS Digital Studio, Museum of Science, and a lot of more. And her work has been viewed by millions of viewers all over the social media and internet, reaching, especially after the post-pandemic world, she is a sensation. And more importantly, she has been recipient of numerous awards such as Eric and Wendy Smith Award and awards from National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine. And she has a wonderful way of storytelling, and more acquainted you would be when she is going to start. And after the webinar, you would have such an amazing roller coaster within just 1 hour. So thank you, Dr. Alex, for joining and taking out time always. And more importantly, another thing I would like to highlight, she has this you could say she creates this immense space, especially for whenever we are reaching her from here from South Asia and global South, and she's very eager and professional to contribute everywhere in terms of diversity and reaching out, especially that I would like to thank always. Thank you, Dr. Alex, for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It is always truly a pleasure to speak with you all every year. It's one of the things I look forward to is being able to come back and talk with everyone. So as Foz mentioned, I'm Alex Dainis. I do a lot of online science communication work, and I'm really excited to talk with you all about science communication online in 2026 and how we can use social media to try and reach more people. So I am going to share some slides. And I'm going to start with a story from some of my work on social media. And I typically use this story to talk about sort of how people are viewing science, but I want to talk about it a little bit today in how we can use social media to actually have a conversation with people versus just talk at people. So back in 2021, 2022, when I was doing a lot of work online talking about COVID, because my PhD had been in RNA biology, and so I felt like I had some things to contribute to this conversation, I was talking about science and I was using the language of science that said words like maybe and likely and possibly, because I was trying to be as accurate as possible. And as you know, it's very hard to be 100% certain about anything in science. And we use these words to try and indicate that we're open to changing our minds and to updating our experiences with new knowledge. But I got a comment that said, when I was in school, science had answers. You don't know what you're talking about. And this stuck with me for so long. And I actually went back recently and I found the exact wording of the comment. It was a little bit different, but this person said, suggesting, kind of, and likely are the terms you use to state what the adjuvant is. That's what I was talking about. Not as confident as the definitions of what you learned in school. And this really stuck with me because I was using this language of uncertainty to show that we were learning in real time what was going on with the virus, with the vaccines. And what this person was hearing was, oh, you're not as confident as school where science had answers, which, as we all know, science is a process. Science isn't just answers. But typically when I tell the story, I talk about the language, I talk about these words of uncertainty. But what actually happened after this comment is that I responded to this person, and then she responded back. And we went back and forth for about 2 hours. And I was just trying to have a conversation with this person about why I was using that language and what we knew and where I was getting my information and what the sources I was using are. And it was a little frustrating and it took a lot of time. But at the end of it, she said thank you. At the end of it, she didn't suddenly decide to go out and get the vaccine, but she had been making videos online about how the vaccine was trying to kill us and all that kind of stuff, and how people taking the vaccine were dumb and all that. And then after we had this conversation, she actually made a video that just said, I'm not going to take it, but I respect the people who are because they're helping protect us. And that to me was huge, that I had used social media to have a conversation with someone and change their mind about a topic. And so I think that's really the power of social media when it comes to science communication, is that it is not just a one-way discussion. You can actually have a conversation with people on social media. You can have a sustained back and forth. And I am not saying everyone should go into the comment section. That's very hard. It's very draining. But you can look at what is happening in there and you can make more content that responds to that. And you can have this sort of back and forth much more quickly with your audience than you can in something like a book or a major documentary or any of those kinds of things. So it's one of the things I really like about social media. So I want to talk about two major things today. I want to talk about a little bit about what is happening in the online science sphere, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think many of us have a sense of this as being people who create content and interact with the internet, but I want to put some numbers and some data on it. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we create good science communication content that can cut through that noise on social media. So this is a piece of data that came out about 2 years ago now, looking at where in the world false information online is posing the biggest threat. And they talked to over 1,000 different experts across a lot of different fields about misinformation. And unfortunately, both the US and Pakistan are in the top 6 nations where people are very worried about social media. This is an unfortunate thing that we both share, that both of our online spheres are incredibly flooded with misinformation. And there's a number of different reasons for this, social and political and all of that. But this is where we exist right now and where I think that we can make the most difference, because we have, and I'll talk a little bit later about making your content really niche. We have connections to these audiences. We're a part of these audiences. And so I think that all of us on this call are well positioned to try and fight this online misinformation. And this is a little out of date now, and I'm worried because this study was coming out year after year, and it didn't come out last year, and I'm worried that their funding got cut. But this is looking in the United States at the percent of adults who have confidence in scientists, and it is dipping a little bit over time. We're seeing after the pandemic there was a bit of a dip, but the thing that I actually like to look at here is that they weren't just asking about scientists, they were also asking about lots of different people, journalists and business leaders and elected officials. And at least in the US, and I think that some of this sentiment carries internationally, scientists are still much more respected and much more trusted than many other fields. And so I think as science journalists, as science communicators, you all have an ability to bridge, journalists, the overall is like 55 to 45%, whereas scientists is 86 to 76%. You have an expertise and you have a point of view that I think can try and cut through some of this. We can try and bring good information to people. Because we know, unfortunately, that people's interest and knowledge in science can impact funding attitudes. So the higher people's scientific knowledge and interest is, the more they think that we should spend money on science research. And the opposite is true too. If you have lower scientific knowledge and lower scientific interest, then there's a decrease in the amount of money you think we should be spending on science. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have seen this. This was looking at 2025 at the amount of research funding that had been spent on different fields in the first half of the year. And it had been cut about in half between the 10-year average and 2025 here in the US. And similarly in Pakistan, this is the most recent data I could find, so it's a little out of date. But, scientific funding peaked around sort of 2007, 2008, and has dropped since then. And so I know in the US, a lot of that drop is because interest and trust in science has dropped. And I would imagine that that is a similar sort of change in Pakistan as well. So again, an unfortunate thing, I think, that we all share, and that I think ties back to that wave of misinformation that we're both experiencing. We also do know on the other side that there can be positive benefits to public stories about science. So this isn't necessarily social media, but this is a story that at the time went pretty viral and gained sort of a lot of public recognition online. So Angelina Jolie came out and said that she had had both a double mastectomy and an oophorectomy to have her ovaries removed because she was at a high risk of breast cancer due to her genetics. And this was a big public story that went out widely, and it significantly impacted in the United States the number of women who were going for genetic testing for breast cancer. So this story came out in 2013, and there was a significant jump in the number of women who went to their doctors and asked for testing for this. And so we know that big public stories can impact people's actions. There was a big story about science. It changed how people acted and reacted. The other thing that I think many of us might be fighting against a little bit is public perception of different scientific fields. So this is a study that was done that asked people how accurate and how precise they felt different scientific fields were. And this has nothing to do with how precise these fields actually are. This is just how people feel about them. And so on the left are the fields that people felt were least precise, and on the right, the fields that people felt were most precise. Now, as a geneticist, I'm pretty sad that genetic engineering and evolution are so far down to the least precise field, whereas forensics, which actually we found in recent years is not a very precise science, is over on the right-hand side. But my theory for why this is because things like forensics have an incredibly good marketing campaign. There are shows like CSI, NCIS. There's movies where like the forensic scientists come in and they save the day. Whereas we don't really have that for climate and genetic engineering and evolution. So I think that, again, we can use media to change people's perceptions of what different fields are. But I thought there was something pretty fascinating that they found in this study, that they could overcome this. If you were talking with someone who felt that, for example, archaeology was an imprecise field, but you showed them one specific archaeological study, you could overcome this. And with the data from that single study, they could think, oh, well, that study looks good because you presented it to me. So looking at sort of the study level can be helpful. So this is where we're at. We are both in places where misinformation is running rampant, where there's a lot of discord online. It's hard for people to figure out who to trust and what to trust. And so what can we do in the social media sphere to try and combat this? So the first thing I actually like to think about in this, which is my goal in social media, my goal is not necessarily that I want everyone who watches my content to become a scientist. I just want people to become competent outsiders. And this phrase came from a study that came out by Osborne and Pimentel in 2023. They were actually talking about students here. They were talking about teachers talking to students and giving them science education to not necessarily train every student to become a scientist, but rather to become a competent outsider. And here's how they defined this. They said that competent outsiders are capable of evaluating scientific claims with a critical lens and judging the credibility of scientific information presented in secondary sources, even when the science itself is beyond their comprehension. And that is really what I strive to do for my audience. I don't necessarily need every one of them to say, oh, I saw this video on social media and now I'm going to go become a geneticist. That'd be lovely, but it's not my goal. I want them to gain sort of a gut sense, to gain an idea when they watch my videos of, is this good? Is this bad? Are people using the right sources? And to use that across the lens of what they're looking at in social media. So this study that came out Again, they were looking at students, but I really like to think about this as my audience as well, of thinking of ways that they could lead students through this, where, they had this sort of workflow for students where, okay, you want to think about who has made a claim. So who is this person in the social media video? Do they have a track record of honesty? Do they have a track record of conflict of interest? Then if they're trustworthy, you start asking, do they have the right expertise? What is the consensus in the field? So it's things that I, as someone who is watching social media videos, sort of inherently am asking because of my scientific background. I want to encourage my audience to do these things as well. So sometimes I'll do this by modeling, right? If I'm looking at a scientific paper in a video, I'll talk about why I trust it or why I don't trust it, right? I'll model this behavior of talking about, is the source credible? I'll also talk about expertise, right? I'll mention, and not in a way that's off-putting, not in a way that's like, oh, I'm trying to pump up my own ego, but I'll mention, when I'm talking about COVID, for example, that my PhD was in RNA biology. There's a lot of things that I am not an expert in, but I am an expert in RNA. I am an expert in, small molecule delivery and that kind of stuff, or in small RNA delivery. So I do think that mentioning that expertise, mentioning your background as it's relevant to the thing that you're talking about is important. And I do also try and talk about consensus. I try and talk about these things when, well, why do I believe this claim? It's because all of these scientists who work in the field, who are maybe bigger experts in this specific topic than I am, uh, agree on this. So I try and model this behavior as a person in my videos on social media in the hopes that it will encourage the audience to do this themselves. And I think it's also hard because and I'm picking an example from the CDC, which has been undergoing incredible changes here in the United States. But I show this to say that it's hard. It's really hard for audiences online to figure this out. These are both CDC websites, and I pulled these on the same day back in November, and I think now the websites have even changed again. One website from cdc.gov here in the United States that says that there's no connection between thimerosal and autism, and a different page on cdc.gov that talks about thimerosal potentially causing developmental symptoms. And so one of these is much more trustworthy than the other is, but they are on the same website. They are being presented by the same organization. And even as an adult, even as someone who is a scientist, it takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of reading in this field to distinguish why one of these is good and one of these is bad. And it is so hard to try and convey that to an online public audience. And it is hard to do that in a way that feels authentic, in a way that feels achievable for them, that they can look at this too. So again, modeling is important. And I think, again, this was talking a lot about students, but I think it is absolutely applicable to social media audiences that we need to help them understand that science is a process. We really need to be thinking about digital media and information literacy. We got to be talking about consensus in science. And we really, really need to be talking on social media about the social practices that the scientific community uses to vet knowledge claims. I think we have to be modeling this. We cannot just be making social media videos or online articles that are talking about press releases and that are talking about one study. I think we really have to be modeling, looking at lots of different sources and figuring out what we trust and what we don't trust from that. I think that's incredibly critical. The other thing I do want to mention just briefly, because it is sort of a pet thing of mine that I love thinking about, is the language that we do use. In that original story that I told at the beginning about the commenter who didn't trust me because I was using words like likely or possibly, there are great studies out there that look at how people use this language, right? So we use the language of uncertainty in science, and I think we should use it publicly and loudly to talk about the fact that science is a process and we are ready to update our understandings if we get more information. But not everybody hears it that way. So this is a great study online that asked people uh, what percentage they would assign to different words like likely and maybe and possibly and then plot them on a graph. And so you can see that for some words like never, everybody thought they meant 0%. For some people, almost always was heard with very high possibility, but things like likely were around 60 to 70%. Things like real possibility had a big range. And so this is a hard problem to tackle just in one language, right? If you're thinking about speaking in just one language, knowing that if you use real possibility and you mean it at 80%, but someone hears it at 20%, they're going to get a very different idea of risk is hard. But also, I think if you are straddling audiences that speak multiple languages, that already have different understandings of these kinds of things, this is incredibly difficult. And so I think just thinking every time that we use language publicly online about how that word is going to be perceived, and if we're using something that might be unclear, assigning a real percentage to it, saying there's a 65% chance, there's a 70% chance, like really using that language so that we're making sure we're on the same page with our audience. And again, I just throw this in here because I really love thinking about the language of uncertainty, that there's a great book on this called Uncertainty, How It Makes Science Advance. And they have a great example in here that we as audiences are pretty good with handling uncertainty in our daily lives, right? If somebody says to us that there's a 95% chance of rain, we're pretty good about taking an umbrella and feeling good about that choice, even though it's not a 100% chance. And I think what we want to do is get people to that sort of gut feeling in the sciences as well. If we say that there's a 95% chance that this vaccine is going to protect you from something, we want people to feel good about taking that, even if it's not a 100% certainty, in the same way that they would feel good about taking an umbrella with them if there was only a 95% chance of rain. So I think using this language publicly, talking about what it means, is really important. But the other thing that I always really, really encourage people to think about when they're doing any kind of scientific communication, but especially online, is to think really clearly about your audience, your goal, and your environment. So when we think about audience, you can talk about the same scientific story in different ways to lots of different audiences. I'm going to tell a scientific story differently if I am talking to a bunch of professors in the field than if I'm talking to a public audience online, right? I'm going to have different ideas of what they already know, what their background is, what they understand, what they don't understand. The goal will also be different. So sometimes you're trying to really communicate a specific piece of knowledge. Sometimes you're trying to change somebody's mind. Sometimes you're trying to encourage them to take an action. And then the environment is different. So depending on how you're presenting a scientific story, you're going to form it in different ways. And I think this is all easiest to see with an example. So this is a paper that came out in 2023 about tool use in a kind of bird called a Goffin's cockatoo. Now, it came out originally as a paper. And so the environment of this is pretty set, right? It's going to be in a journal. There are a lot of rules about how you have to tell a scientific story in a journal. Their audience was other scientists, so they could assume that they knew about these birds a little bit, about some of these, types of studies. And their goal was really just to communicate their findings. And this is great. They did all these things well in this paper. But this paper was also picked up in other places online. So for example, it was picked up by the New York Times, which has a very different audience goal and environment. So the audience here is not necessarily other scientists. The goal is really to sort of get people to understand a little bit about what's going on in the sciences, but maybe not to specifically talk about each method they used and each sort of piece of data that they found. And the environment is different, right? This is people who are flipping through a newspaper, maybe people who are looking at it online. So they tell the story in a different way. Instead of just copying and pasting the information from that journal, they started off with an interview, right? Cockatoos contain contradictions. That's a great hook. They behave like gremlins, says one of the study authors. Imagine a toddler with pliers in their head, right? They're using this hook to pull people in this different environment in to keep them reading. But this also went to social media, and it was presented in yet another way. So on the right, we have a tweet from the New York Times that was trying to get people to that article. So on Twitter, the environment is very different, right? You're scrolling pretty quickly. You have to catch somebody. So there's an image right up front to stop people. They have just one line. Imagine a toddler with pliers in their head, right? So they're really trying to capture people quickly. They're trying to get people to click. That's the goal of this. And on the left, there was a TikTok about this. So here, they used a little bit of text, but their main type of way of explaining this story, because of the environment it's a video environment. This is actually a video of the cockatoo using a tool, right? They're trying to get there and to, they're really trying to show you this. So you can take the same story and you can present it in different ways on social media with different audiences and different goals and different environments. So this is an example that I did of this recently, where I really wanted to talk about amino acids online. And sitting someone down and just saying, here's what an amino acid is, can be a pretty boring video. But if you were going to write a book, that's what you would do, right? If you're going to write a textbook, the audience is students, the goal is to get 100% accuracy. You're going to write everything down really clearly. If you were going to write a blog post, maybe you would talk about the different ways that these amino acids were used. But I wanted to try something different. And so what I did is I tasted all of the amino acids one by one in a series that I posted across social media. And so every day I took out an amino acid and I started with a hook. I started with, a little reaction from me. But then I talked through some of the science. I talked in week 1 about the structure of amino acids. In week 2, I talked a little bit about the single letter code of amino acids. But then I tasted them and I had a genuine reaction and I had a genuine moment with the audience. So my audience here is people who maybe have a passing interest in science, but also, I'll be very honest, one of my goals was to reach people who maybe didn't actually know what amino acid was, but had heard the word, right? We hear amino acids in the protein marketing campaigns. We hear it in sort of the wellness space. So I wanted to try and get some of those people in. And my goal was really just to introduce people to the fact that amino acids are molecules and maybe get them to learn a little bit of the biochemical structure of that. And the environment was social media. So I did it in a video. I did it in kind of a fun, hooky way. So if I were writing a textbook, I would not have done this at all. But I wasn't writing a textbook. I was on social media. I was trying to pull people in. And so I did something a little fun with the amino acids instead. And I love this layout from a book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. They are brothers. They were at the business school at Stanford. And they wrote a book on mostly for marketing, but I think a lot of their topics can be really useful in social media as well, about how to get people to listen to a story. And they use the success principles, or this little acronym that they talk about: simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And this, I think, is so important for social media. First, you got to be simple. You got to be really quick and to the point. People are scrolling really quickly. They have, a second to move on to the next thing. So you got to find the core of your story really quickly. And if it is unexpected, if you can get somebody's, attention really quickly, you can keep their attention. So that's why what I was doing in the amino acid videos is I was suddenly tasting something and it was really crazy and it was an amino acid. It was unexpected. It was maybe not what people thought they were going to see when they scrolled that day. So they stopped because they wanted to learn more. Also make it really concrete. So you say up front what you were talking about. I said taste testing every amino acid, day whatever, and the name of the amino acid. I made it really clear what people were talking about. Credibility, again, is important. Any place where you can pop in why they should believe you, thinking through those things before. Emotion is really important. So again, I was showing sort of like reactions, like some of them tasted good. So I was showing this, happy reaction. Some of them tasted terrible. So I was showing like a really sort of disgusted reaction, but showing emotion, which is something that we are taught as scientists not to do in our communication. We are taught as scientists to be very detached, to only talk about the facts, but that emotion is what gets people talking to you. It's what pulls people in. And stories are also really, really important. Sharing a story, connecting with people on a human level can really help keep them engaged with your content. Two other things in that book that I really love. One of them is this quote: "To strip an idea down to its core, we must be masters of exclusion. We must relentlessly prioritize." And this, to me, is the core of good social media videos. You have 30 seconds, 60 seconds. Maybe you have 140 characters on Blue Sky. Maybe you have, just a little bit of a, tweet or a post or something. You need to make sure that you are only talking about the core idea. What is the essence of what you want to get across? Because that's all you have time for in social media. And then just to back that up, people are tempted to tell you everything with perfect accuracy right up front when they should be giving you just enough info to be useful, then a little more, then a little more. And I think we know this again in journalism, right? You think of the inverted pyramid, you tell people the big headline first, then a little more information, then a little more information. But I think that is just as applicable to social media too. Give people just what they need, then a little more, then a little more, to keep them with you and to prevent them from scrolling away. Now, one of the other things that people ask all the time is, how do you figure out your audience, right? How do you know who you're talking to? And I think one of the best things about that is just to ask. Again, this is where the social part of social media comes in. So ask, talk with your audience. Ask them, what are you interested in? What do you know? What do you not know? Look in the comment section. If you post a video, if you post an article, you can tell pretty quickly in the comments if people are confused, if they needed more information. Use that to course correct for next time. Sometimes I also say, find a proxy, right? I was talking with a woman who really wanted to make a children's book. She had a great idea for writing a children's book about science. And I said, okay, do you have kids? And she didn't have kids. And I was like, well, have you talked to a kid about this, right? Like, find some people who are in your desired audience and talk with them. Ask them about, what they want to see, what they don't want to see. Again, figure out if you are part of your audience, right? I try and make videos that are things that I think I would want to watch, that are things that people around me would want to watch. Like, I try and think about, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? By talking about it with people around me. If I'm out to coffee with a friend and I'm like, oh, I'm working on a video about XYZ, and they're uninterested, I know it might not be a good video topic. But if I tell them about it and they're like, oh, tell me more, I know that it's a good thing. So interact with people, ask about that. And again, one of the benefits of social media, it's been seen for such a long time as a negative, but I really do think that carefully engaging with comments, if you feel safe doing so, if you, can, I think can really tell you a lot about your audience and what they want and don't want. I also truly love this book. It is the book I recommend. Is it sitting next to me? Oh, it is sitting next to me right now because I use it as a reference all the time. I love, love, love this book about science communication, called Strategic Science Communication. They break down the audience goal and environment topic even further into sort of goals, objectives, and tactics. So your goals are maybe to get people to take an action. Your objectives are how you want them to feel, the beliefs you want them to have so that they take that action. And then the tactics are how you're going to get there. These are the kinds of things we think about, where you're going to put your communication, what tone you're going to use, all those kinds of things, which I think is super important. They also, so this is an article written in part by one of the authors of that, talk about public engagement in science in a few different ways. So they want it to be, good public engagement in science is strategic. So it's guided by clear goals that you've set at the beginning. It's cumulative. And again, this is where I think social media is important, that you can build and build and build with your audience. It's reciprocal. So it is conversation, right? You are talking back and forth with your audience. You are not just talking at them. It's reflexive. So if you find out your audience didn't understand something last time, you can update, you can, make changes. It's equitable. So again, we're recognizing injustices that have happened in the past. We're acknowledging our biases. We're trying to make things inclusive, and it's evidence-based. So we are talking about knowledge, again, about the process of science, how it's made, and what we're doing. And this, I think, this was a quote from another great source, Communicating Science Effectively, that says the purpose of formal public engagement is to facilitate the exchange of information, knowledge, perspectives and preferences among groups that differ in expertise, power, and values, and help them find common ground. And there is nothing that I think we can use more for this than social media. So one thing I also try and think about all the time is how I want my audience on social media to feel. I think there's a lot of science communication out there online that is just sort of yelling at people, right? Here's what scientists say, and if you don't understand it, you're dumb. I think that's a terrible way of doing science communication. No one has ever changed my mind by making me feel dumb. And so I want my audience to feel smart. I want them to feel understood. I want them to feel inspired and curious, and I want them to feel empowered to use science. So every time I make a post, every time I make a video, I am thinking about how do I want my audience to feel during this? Because this is how I would want someone to talk to me. And so this is how I want to talk to somebody else online. Now, the other thing that this is a couple years out of date now, but I think is still really, really relevant for social media, is a report that came out in 2023, sponsored by the Webby Awards and YouGov and a couple different places, where they were looking at trends online and trends in social media. And they ended up titling the whole report, Never Niche Enough. So the lovely thing about social media is that you can get really, really specific with your content, and there is an audience out there for it. I think a mistake that people often make is trying to make social media content that appeals to everybody. And if you try and appeal to everybody, in the end, you're going to appeal to nobody. So niching down in social media, getting really, really, really specific about who you want to talk to and what you want to talk about is so helpful. So they were looking a lot here at Gen Z. They found that they spend a lot of time online. So 41% of Gen Z spends 21 hours per week online. 16% spend 49 hours per week online. So Gen Z is spending tons and tons of time online. And the things that they are looking for, one of their big motivators is connection and belonging. And they were, again, sort of looking at Gen Z, but I think this is true across a lot of different age groups. People are looking for people like them. They are looking to find a community to join. They are looking for people who look like them, sound like them, are from the same spaces as them, talking about the things that they are interested in. So I want you to think really deeply about who you are and how you can find people like you online, because just by being you, you don't need to be somebody else online, right? Just by being you and showing up as who you are, as excited about the things that you're excited about, and creating a space for that in science communication on social media is incredibly important. Because one of the other big motivators that people looked for was authenticity. They want to see creators who, whether it's true or not, are making things that feel real. They want to see people who are talking about things because it really does excite them. They want to feel that. They don't want, someone like me who loves science coming in and trying to make history content, right? That doesn't mean I don't think history is valuable. That doesn't mean I don't think that history is important, but it's not authentic to me, right? I would really struggle to make good content about that. Whereas I can come in and talk about genetics, I can talk about chemistry, I can talk about, fun ways of using these things, and the internet can tell that. So I just want to encourage you that if you are going to make social media content, I want you to show up in whatever way feels safe for you. Some people do not feel safe online, and that's fine. You do not have to do that. But if you feel safe, if you feel like you're in a space that you can do that, show up as yourself and and talk about the things that you're genuinely interested in. People really do respond to that on social media. Again, the other thing I want to stress is that the power of social media is that, and I know this is going to sound a little silly and a little cliche, but I've really used it as sort of a guiding principle recently, is that online science communication can become science conversation. You can talk back and forth with people online in a way, again, that you can't if you just write a book, if you just publish something, on a broadcast channel. And so this is a study from the Tormala lab at Stanford that does a lot of work on changing people's minds and how we can create content that can bridge divides. And they found that if you were in a debate with someone and you both had to ask a question and were asked questions, both parties became more receptive to hearing what the other person had to say. So preparing questions and being asked questions made people feel more open to changing their mind. So this is something, again, that you can do on social media, is you can both ask your audience questions and you can encourage them to ask you questions, and then you can answer them, right? That comment section, again, has been seen as such a scary thing for so long, but I think if you use it wisely, and I think if you develop a sense. I've been online for about 15 years now as someone who's publicly communicating. I have developed a good gut sense for someone who is just asking a question and someone who is a troll. And I think many of us have, right? Just by being online. Ignore the trolls, don't engage with them. But I think engaging with the people who are genuinely asking questions can be a great way to change minds. And the other wonderful thing about doing this on social media is that other people can see it even if they're not engaging in that conversation. So I had a conversation maybe about a year and a half ago now in a comment section with someone who was staunchly anti-vaccine. And I tried to have a civil and kind conversation where we were asking each other questions. I asked her why she thought different things. She asked me why I thought different things. We went back and forth. We had just a conversation. And I didn't change her mind. At the end of it, she said she still wasn't going to vaccinate her children, but she thanked me for having that conversation very civilly, because not a lot of people would online. And since then, I get notifications that people have liked my comments in that chat. So even people who were not a part of that conversation can see it because that social media exists publicly, and they were later on engaging with it. So even if you're not changing the mind of that one specific person you're talking to, other people can see it in this space. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And there's a book on this that I also really, really love called How Minds Change by David McRaney. And he talks a lot about a topic called deep canvassing. And this was popularized by a group here in Los Angeles when there were a couple of different pretty divisive topics on a bill about things like gay marriage here in California. And they had people go out to people's homes, and rather than just ask them how they were going to vote on that issue, they had conversations with these people. They asked them questions. They encouraged them to ask questions. They shared personal anecdotes, and they asked the other people to share personal anecdotes. And through this, they changed people's minds about these topics. So deep canvassing is a structured interview that uses long, empathetic conversations with the intention of shifting participants' beliefs. So if you are talking with someone, which again, I think is the power of social media, versus talking at someone, you can really change minds and you can really reach people in a new way. So the last thing that I want to encourage you to do when you're thinking about all of your scientific communications, but especially online, especially in social media spaces, is what do you bring to the conversation? What specific viewpoint do you bring? What specific community are you a part of that maybe isn't getting, a lot of conversation in the scientific space, that maybe isn't getting a lot of attention? And show up in that space. Be you in that space. If you're going to engage in social media, and again, you do not have to. Not everyone feels safe and comfortable engaging in social media, and that is fine. That is absolutely okay. Not everybody has to do it. But if this is something that you want to do, I just really, really want to encourage you to show up as yourself and to engage in the communities that you're already a part of, right? So many of us have maybe religious groups that we're a part of, community groups that we're a part of, family groups that we're a part of, friend groups that we're a part of, right? Show up in those spaces and have these conversations and think about how you can use social media to reach those people. So with that, I left mini PCR's logo on here. Ignore that. With that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and talking with me today, especially for these cohorts. I always really would encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I have connected with so many of the prior members of these cohorts on LinkedIn, and I am so excited every time I see you all publishing pieces and posting about them. And anytime that I can sort of continue to help out, I've gone and I've talked at book clubs for some of our prior members. Yes, thank you so much, Foz, for putting that in the chat. Please connect with me there. Reach out if there's anything I can do. And please share with me the work that you're doing online. I love seeing it, and I love seeing what all of you produce during the internship and after. So I would love to connect with you there. So with that, we have a few more minutes. I would love to open it up. Again, as I said, I think this should be a conversation, not just a one-way talk. So if you have questions, if there's anything I can answer about science communication in social media or other places, I would love to do so now. And you can put them in the chat too. You can raise your hand or put them in the chat, whatever's easier.
Okay. Feel free to ask questions. You can put in the chat, and you can also ask directly to Dr. Alex. And well, I have this question about. I mean, since you showed the maps where, for example, Pakistan, India, and especially the US and these countries. I mean, especially these countries, I think are especially where we have large populations. I mean, what do you think are the major aspects of misinformation, especially in these regions?
Yeah, so well, the one I can speak to, because it's the one I experience most, is the United States. And a lot of it comes from, honestly, sort of a political and social divide at this point in time, that I think people are trying to find community, and they are and this is one thing, and I'll talk about another thing, and they are leaning into sort of signifiers of things that make them part of one community or part of another community, and they just sort of get pulled down these paths where, well, and I'm going to pick something random, but there was a lot of research into flat earth groups for a while, that flat earthers did not necessarily become flat earthers because they had an experience with the planet where they felt like, the planet must be flat. It's because there were all of these other things that they were looking for in a community. Maybe they felt ostracized, maybe they felt put out, kind of thing. And they found community in this group that all felt that the earth was flat. And so they were like, well, I must also believe that to be a part of this group, right? There's this sort of in-group, out-group divide that is happening, I think, around the world, but especially here in the United States, where we latch on to these different realities to try and become a part of groups. The other thing that I see a lot online is that misinformation is very lucrative, right? You can make a lot of money by selling, supplements online that don't actually do anything. But if you say this is going to cure your cancer and doctors don't want you to know about this and all that kind of things, I think misinformation has become incredibly lucrative. And sometimes the misinformation spreads because someone is trying to sell something. They're trying to get you to be a part of their wellness group, all that kind of stuff. But other times it's because people are genuinely confused. And I think that this is the thing. I think there are so many factors that have gone into this. I think many of our public institutions here in the United States, and I think in other places around the world, have done a poor job of communication. And so people would much rather connect with a friendly face online, whether or not that friendly face is telling you good things. And it's really hard to tell, that I like to think I'm always presenting accurate, good science information, but why should they believe me over the person who looks just like me also wearing a white lab coat online, right? So it's become very hard because I think institutionally from the government level, we're losing a lot of that. So it's a whole bunch of factors coming all together. I love this question from Mohammed. So with algorithms increasingly prioritizing short form, emotionally charged content, how can science communicators maintain nuance without losing reach? This is a question that I think about all the time. So I think one of the things is that you don't have to do everything in one video. I try and remind myself of this all the time, that I do think that there's a variation in the kinds of posts and the kinds of videos you can make. So sometimes I'm making a video that is just a quick fact, right? That is like, hey, I'm really harping on vaccines today. I don't know why, but hey, like the vaccine is 95% effective and here's the data we know behind it, right? Like we're doing something quick, snappy, and short. And then in the next video, I can do something else that adds a little more nuance. And then in the next video, I can do something that adds a little more nuance. So I think thinking about some videos, it's been broken down online before as like evergreen content, and then like, content that brings people in. You can think about different content where not every video has to do every job. Sometimes you're just trying to deliver one piece of information. Then maybe the next one you can give a little bit more nuance. Maybe the next one is a little longer, but you have that audience base you've already built. So sometimes you have videos that are trying to pull people in and hook people, and sometimes then you're trying to follow up with more information about that. So I think both finding a balance between that hook, but then also being like, oh, I hooked you, and now let's talk a little bit more about it, because you have that buildability in social media that I think can try and help ameliorate that a little bit. So the next question, this is another thing I've been thinking about a lot. How do we think AI is influencing the science communication space? When we're witnessing a lot of AI slop being circulated online, how can writers maintain their voice and human element? This is huge. I worry about this all the time. And I've seen it in the social media space where sometimes there are science communicators who I think are using AI to write their scripts, and they're getting things wrong, and they're not getting all the facts correct. Or I'm seeing these videos that are completely AI created. And I've heard from some creators, they feel like, well, I can't keep up if I don't use AI, right? Like, how do I fight back against this? And I think that's where that authenticity is actually something that people crave, right? People don't like AI slop. It gets a lot of reach, but people don't relate to it. They don't come back to it. You're not really building an audience with that AI. And I think now is a time where it's incredibly important for us as creators to talk about it, to talk about our sources, to talk about, yeah, I didn't use ChatGPT to write the script. I went and I read this paper. I went and I looked at this, and then I talked to this expert, and then I did this. It's that modeling behavior I talked about before. I also think, again, this is why it is so important to show up as a person, because admittedly, AI is getting better at sounding like people, but it still doesn't sound like a person, right? If you read an article written by AI, you can kind of tell. We all still can kind of tell that it wasn't written by a human. I think leaning into your human voice, talking like a human, if you're in a social media video, writing like a human, showing up authentically, again, in the language and I don't even necessarily mean language, excuse me, in terms of, like English versus Urdu or whatever. Like, I also mean the language that you speak to your friends, right? Versus the language that you would speak in a formal setting, like using more informality online, using, I always try and think about, how would I say this to a friend? How would I say this if I was just having tea with a friend and we were just chatting? Using that kind of language makes us feel more human. And I do think people still crave that. And my theory is that people are going to crave it more and more as we get into a landscape where more stuff is just written by AI. So I will say, I do not use AI in my writing at all. I do not use it to do research. I do not use it to write outlines. And part of that is really to do exactly what you've said at the end here, is to try and maintain my voice in the human element. I worry that if I use those things, I would start to sound more and more like them. So it is, and everybody has a different process, but like, I've really strictly said, I will not use it to write anything. And I don't know if you use Gmail, but Gmail now, sometimes if you hit reply, it generates an auto reply and I'm like, no, I go in and I delete it. I'm like, no, I don't want to sound like that. So that authenticity, I think, is important as well.
Another question is also, since we are all working within the content creation realm. So another project I work on, we also have this discussion with regard to AI and as well as short form content. So there is also this challenge. How do you see the problem of brain rot, the attention span? This is
Yeah.
something, for example, and there is this also, for example, I mean, we were talking about amino acid video, and we watch science reels all the time, and they are at some point informative, like we are grasping the information as well. But how do you see it? It's ruining the attention span. Like, as you know, there has been studies like and teachers and within colleges, university, people and student people are not able to concentrate. So how do you see it from attention span point of view? Last question.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to that, because I will say that's also something that kind of terrifies me, that people's attention spans are dropping rapidly. And I see it in myself too, right? I'll see it, if I get a little bored, I'm like, oh, I'll just pull out my phone. And I'm like, no, put the phone down. Like, you don't need to do that. I've been talking with some other science communicators a lot recently about actually getting offline, and trying to create in-person things. This talk is about social media, but I actually think that a large portion of what I want to do moving into 2026, moving into 2027, is offline things, is things where we are in person with people. Maybe we're sharing a meal and we're talking about science communication. Maybe we're, at a book club and sharing science communication. But I hate to say it because so much of my work is online, but is finding spaces to both, stay on social media and do that, but also create in-person things where we are offline, we are off our phones, we are disconnected, because I think all of us need that right now, right? We have become so sucked into these algorithms. I think creating spaces in person is going to become increasingly important to keeping all of us healthy, not just informed, but healthy as well. So I try and do that in my personal life, and I'm thinking more and more about how I can do that in my professional life as well.
Okay, we can take this more question and then we can
Okay.
and
So one last question: how do we make concepts that are abstract and conceptually complex accessible and imaginable to an ordinary reader or layman? Again, this comes back to me for thinking about why you as the science communicator are excited about this concept. And I have an example where I was working with a scientist a few years ago about trying to communicate her very complex genetics research. And I kept asking her, okay, but why do you care about this? Why do you care about this? And every time she would answer me, she would say, well, it's important for the agricultural, blah, blah, blah. She was going into grant speak, right? She was using the language she would have to use in a paper or in a grant. And I just kept pushing her. I was like, no, why are you excited? Why are you excited? And finally, she just looked at me and she was like, there's yellow flowers and white flowers in the same field, and we don't know why. And I was like, yes, like that's where we want to start, right? Like the true reason of why you were excited about this. And so I think if we start there in our communication, people will come with us for some of that more complex stuff. Because like, all right, that's a cool question, right? Why are there white flowers and yellow flowers? Then you tell me a little bit about how flowers make their color. Okay. And then you tell me about the genes that control that, right? So you start from that like interest point and you get people hooked. And then little by little, you give them just what they need to follow along with you. And I think about this a lot of like, you're going to hold their hand through the story, right? You're not just going to give them a bunch of information. You're just going to give them a little bit and then a little bit and a little bit so they can walk with you through that story. So that's always my thing, is like, if it's really complex, of course it is, right? Like science is very complex, but there's some reason why that scientist really loves this thing. And it probably, and maybe it is the complexity, right? But they'll describe it as because they love solving the puzzle. And like, all right, people like puzzles, they can get there. So I think starting from that excitement and giving them just what they need as they need it to follow the story is how you can tackle some of these really complex things.
well, quite a very wonderful discussion and the informative presentation and everything. And I think we every year, especially for me as well, and also I mean, we get so much updated information. So many things are changing, and especially you mentioned about doing the in-person event and how we can redo it, and also taking it as an opportunity to be in person with people, number one, and also as you pointed out, another opportunity, because if AI is going to take over, and it is going to be like this, so how we could value more back again the human interaction especially.
Yeah.
And so thank you, like, for always taking out time and doing this. This has been amazing, just like the previous ones. And you could see the feedback and everyone questions. And thank you for taking out time, the energy, and have a nice day. Bye bye.
You as well. Thank you all so much for joining. I'll see you all next year.
Exactly. Soon, maybe. Soon, maybe.
Yes, even sooner.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Have a good one.